Hello? Hello? Good? Cool. Hi everybody, my name is Sean O'Brien. I grew up in the Northeast, lived out here in the Bay Area now for about 7 or 8 years. I was raised by a feminist racial justice advocate and an Irish socialist that struggled for Irish independence in the 80s. So I've mentioned my folks because I think it made me who I am a lot. And then my experience over the last few years has been with anarchist infrastructure projects, mainly unconventional action in the Bay, as well as the new social center called The Holdout that we're opening up here in West Oakland. But on the other side of things, I've also worked with Greenpeace on and off for about 4 or 5 years, and have done other work with nonviolent direct action groups such as DASW. So I feel like I have a pretty balanced approach to this topic, and I'm hoping that we can come out all respecting each other and have all of our opinions challenged. So thanks. All right. If you weren't tired of hearing me talk, then I'll continue. So to elaborate a little bit on who I am, because one of the things that I hope to do in the next few minutes is to challenge some of the stereotypes or notions about who supports the idea of diversity of tactics. So I want to say I come from a place of incredible respect and appreciation for the effectiveness of civil disobedience and nonviolent direct action. As I said, I worked with Greenpeace for a number of years and have been a dedicated member of a number of different nonviolent direct actions. With Greenpeace, Direct Action to Stop the War, and a number of other groups. I've worked as a police liaison, I've worked as a nonviolence trainer. At different actions, I've had some pretty intense things happen, like having guns pointed in my face, or having angry security members threaten to cut my climbing rope while I was 20 stories up on a building. I mention these things not really to brag about things that I've been a part of, but to try and let people know that in all of these I remain dedicated to the principles of nonviolence that I felt like were appropriate for that action. I share this to try and break down that stereotype of who we call, of what we call people that support a diversity of tactics, and kind of break down this idea that it's a bunch of angry, aggro men who are unconvinced of the effectiveness of nonviolent action. The media has helped this portrayal a bit, but to be honest, a number of people within our anarchist or radical political scenes have also, I think, contributed to that stereotype. I think people who discard civil disobedience as ineffective or weak or just kind of silly are actually doing the movement a disservice as well. To me, the main word that's important in diversity of tactics is the first one, diversity. And it means that all things that might be effective or strategically appropriate are on the table. So while I do advocate for diversity of tactics, I'm also frustrated with what that term has kind of come to mean within our movement. So I want to challenge my comrades in the radical community to start sincerely looking at all options with an equal amount of respect. And many times peaceful actions actually do make the most sense and will be the most strategic. That being said, I also challenge those who profess an exclusively nonviolent movement to put aside the moralistic approach to this issue and to start talking about what's effective and not effective, and not talking about what's moral and immoral or right and wrong, because I think that's the wrong conversation to have. In terms of that, I think one of the main problems with an exclusively quote-unquote nonviolent movement is that it immediately requires a definition of what is violent and what is not. So this, unfortunately, is why we end up in this never-ending conversation about what's violent, what's not violent, and not what's effective and what's not effective. It's often, unfortunately, when a movement becomes nonviolent, that definition is often the lowest common denominator, or the most narrow definition of what violence means. And the problem with this is that there's a number of things that exist in that gray area, right? So that gray area includes things like self-defense when you're being attacked, right? Throwing tear gas canisters back at police when you have them fired upon you, even to more complicated things like industrial sabotage that some people might consider very violent, but other people might not, right? So all these are examples of things that tend to get thrown out the window immediately when a movement is exclusively nonviolent. The danger in silencing those alternative ideas is that it doesn't actually stop them from happening. Okay, if a movement considers itself nonviolent and pushes out people who want to do anything that movement considers violent, it doesn't actually stop those tactics from happening. It just eliminates any process for accountability or for discussion after an action, and instead has them happen just kind of in this scattered orientation that really isn't focused at all. So I think there's two examples of that. I think the night of November 2nd is a good example, where a number of different things happened that night, including an occupation, including a march that targeted a number of banks, and then including things like lighting barricades on fire and fighting back against police. After that night, the discussion didn't turn to which of those things were effective when they happened and which weren't. The discussion turned to whether violence was wrong, whether it was moral, or whether it was wrong and immoral. And that's an example of why that discussion is so detrimental, I think, to moving forward. So another example historically is Nelson Mandela speaking on why South Africa had an armed wing in their movement. And he said it was as much to focus the anger and militancy of people that were legitimately upset, to take that anger and focus it in strategic places. And if they didn't have an armed wing, then these things would have happened all over the place, and it actually wouldn't have been as focused. So I think that's an argument for it. The last point I'll make is I don't actually think there's an example historically of a time when nonviolence alone has brought major revolutionary structural changes. I'm still waiting for that example. I want to read a quote real quick from Martin Luther King's Nonviolence, The Only Road to Freedom. He says, "The American racial revolution has been a revolution to get in rather than to overthrow. We want to share in the American economy, the housing market, the educational system, and the social opportunities. The goal itself indicates that a social change in America must be nonviolent." So my question to people is, what is our goal? Is our goal in this Occupy movement to be included back in this broken system? Is it to participate in the housing market? Is it to lower taxes? Is it to be in a little less debt and own our house and cars again like we did in the 90s? Or is it to actually tear down this corrupt system and build something in its place? If it's just to get back in, then I agree, nonviolence can get us there. If it's to tear down this entire structure and build something better, then it's only going to take us so far, and we're going to come to a point where it's not as effective, and it's not going to be enough. So, thank you.